So, to celebrate the fact that we are now at 5,000 subscribers, I thought we should do something a little bit silly. So today, to celebrate, we are going to look at one of my very first high school sewing projects, which is what's on the mannequin behind me here. Just got sight of the orange poly satin, oh god. And this I made for my GCSE textiles coursework. So I made it in my last year of high school. I was 15, turning 16, and it's supposed to be a costume for the ensemble of West Side Story. Because it was for a qualification, you couldn't just make whatever you wanted, it had to fit a brief. And so there was a brief that was something along the lines of a fancy dress costume, and I asked my teacher if I could adapt that to make it a theatre costume. I was not into costuming at all at this time. I thought I wanted to be an engineer, but I was also a theatre kid. And I think I just happened to have seen a production of West Side Story that really, inspired me and impressed me. And so I thought I'd make a costume. Who would have thought that 10 years later, I would be a professional costume maker? Not 16-year-old Claude, I tell you. For context, the qualification I was taking was in design technology. So it wasn't so much about the artistic design side of things, it was more about construction and technique. Which I like to think is part of the reason why the design is so bad, but I'm not a natural designer at all. Can you tell? I like being told what to do and making it. So this was supposed to be for an ensemble member in West Side Story. Obviously, I didn't really know a lot about vintage at the time. I was obviously going on some sort of polka dot stereotypes from fancy dress and pin-up costumes I'd seen. I do remember writing about Dior's new look though and the influence of that, but seeing as West Side Story is 1957 and the new look was 47, I was a bit behind the times. The worst thing about this is definitely the fabric choice. This is a poly cotton and this is a polyester satin. And as hideous as it is, in my defense, I live in the middle of the countryside. This was 2009 when I was buying these fabrics. Home sewing was just totally out of fashion. There wasn't a fabric shop where I live for 20 miles. I had to travel 20 miles. When I got there, it was a fabric land. So that is why we've got such hideous, cheap looking fabrics. Online fabric shopping wasn't really a thing then. Definitely buying patterns, you had to go into a shop and look through the catalogue and then they had to order it in for you and you had to go back and pick it up. When I think about it now, the sewing world has changed so much for the better since I took my GCSEs. So I think I can forgive myself a little bit on a few of the questionable choices. Now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my camera setup and I'm going to put this on the table. And like Abby Cox does those videos where she studies the historical costumes with the camera and gives all you nice tasty close-ups of the stitching? Yeah, we're going to do that, but with my GCSE textiles coursework. And you can see how far I've come in 11 years? Yeah, 11 years. All right, let's go. Okay, so the quality's changed because you're on my phone over there and I've got my new camera in my hand here ready to go. I'm not gonna lie, my first impressions of this is that, it's not actually that bad. Okay, the stitching's quite neat, it's quite well made. I obviously knew a little bit about what I was doing. So first of all, this opening here, if you look at the way I've stitched this Velcro on, it's quite neat and even. I'm impressed. So I obviously thought about the fact, and I think I actually remember writing this in my coursework, about the reason I chose Velcro was because it was to aid with quick changes. Brilliant, perfectly valid, thinking about the use of the garment, lovely. However, when I look at this now as somebody who has worked in the theatre, I would not use Velcro like this. If I were to use Velcro at all, first of all, I would use several small sections, because inevitably what happens is when you try and Velcro up a strip like this in a hurry, you end up with something looking like that, or it's completely off balance and all things like that. Also, the continued tugging and ripping on Velcro, it makes the Velcro perforate. So it just eventually pulls out of the stitching and you've got these horrid frayed edges. So if I were going to use Velcro now, I would not use a straight stitch, I would zigzag it on, and that sort of helps prevent perforation and fraying. So if you're making a costume and you want to use Velcro for a quick change, first of all,
zigzag it on. Second of all, do several smaller pieces as opposed to one long strip, and it will prevent a lot of difficulties for you. That being said, I wouldn't use Velcro. If it were up to me, I wouldn't use Velcro. I would use poppers instead, or snaps, as they call them in the rest of the world. You know, the fastening, it's all right. I mean, the covered buttons are not very well covered. You can see they're not particularly round, but I imagine that's probably to do with the horrid nature of this satin. In fact, can you see that? It's fraying badly through the little hole there. So, you know, fair enough, working with what you had. So this as well, I'm quite impressed with this facing. I mean, it's that horrid papery interfacing, which does not launder well, so that's a poor choice for a theatrical costume, but again, that was probably a budget thing or an availability thing. That's probably all they had at Fabricland. But it's quite neatly set in. You know, like look at this at the bottom here, that's quite nice. You know, that edge I've turned under there and finished and edge stitched it. You know, the stitching's pretty neat and even. So yeah, not too bad. The thing that is striking me is the pressing is not good. That's not really well pressed on the edge there. The roll here is pressed in, but not very well. You can see it's only kind of, you know, really like a turn back like that. I would want to be much crisper. And I can see straight away things like the hem are not well pressed. So I imagine that will be a running theme. And I can actually see, on talking of pressing, the darts. Let's talk about the darts, because this one here isn't too bad. I haven't pressed it exactly, and it looks like I've just stopped a little bit short with the stitching. But you know, it's all right, it's acceptable. They could do with a better press. Probably a better press would sort some of that puckering out. Oh, look, yeah, you can see what I mean there. But, you know, it's not too bad, acceptable. This side is much worse. It looks like this one is shorter than this one, so I imagine what's happened here is I haven't stitched all the way to the apex of the dart, and as a result, yeah, look, you can see in there, look at that. We've got this horrid pucker here that I've pressed in, so I obviously attempted to press it. But yeah, that is not sitting nicely. And the same with the bust dart, haven't stitched all the way to the end. Interesting that I did it right, sort of, on one and not the other. I don't know whether that was just time or laziness, or maybe that I did that one first and then that one, and that's why this one's better. I don't know. Let's look at the inside. Yeah, look at that. You can see I have not run off the edge of the fabric there, and that is what is causing all those issues. Looks like I haven't reversed either, but I have reversed on this one, which is probably adding to some of the bulky puckering issues there, because if you watch my videos, you know that these days I like to not reverse at the points of my darts and tie the threads off instead for a crisper finish. So good effort, needs improvement. So what else have we got inside? Let's have a look. Well, I mean, we'll talk about this hem in a minute, but something I did notice is rookie error. Can you see here? The seam goes one way, is pressed to the back at the armhole, but to the front at the hem. Don't know why I didn't unpick that and redo the hem. Maybe it was a time thing. Maybe I just didn't notice. I actually really like this seam finish with the stitching the seam and then pressing the seam allowance to one side and overlocking them together. Yes, it's an industrial seam finish. I imagine we did industrial seam finishes because this was a DT class, a design and technology class. But it, you know, it's perfectly acceptable. It looks very neat and tidy, so I might do it more often, to be honest. And again, on the armholes, I think this looks really tidy, overlocking it like that. There's never really a good way to finish the seam allowances of armholes. I mean, you can do a bias bound armhole, but then that adds bulk, and sometimes you have to clip the curve, and then that starts to fray. So binding it isn't great for that, and you know, there's not really a great solution to it, but I actually think that this is pretty acceptable. Oh, look, there's some tension issues on the sewing machine there. School sewing machine, you know, been hammered quite badly in its time. So yeah, interesting. The facing here is slip stitched to the shoulder seam. That must have been a suggestion in the pattern, I guess. There's something funny happening with the collar, and I'm not entirely sure what. It looks like, yeah, it looks like it was sandwiched in with the facing, and then this bit, it looks like I've slip stitched it. Yeah, looks like I've slip stitched it. You can't really see the stitching, so I must have done it pretty invisibly, which is nice. I do remember that I altered the pattern for the collar to be rounded like this. Looks like it was triangular and I just chopped a bit off, which is acceptable, I suppose. Not sure why I wanted a rounded collar though. There was probably some justification, but I didn't keep the written component of this because it was an A3 portfolio, so we'll never know, and I can't remember. Okay, let's look at the sleeves. I do remember doing a slash and spread, you know, the very sort of bog standard pattern alteration where you cut up and spread them out and redraw around it. And I think I did that partly because I knew it would get me more marks, but also I had this misguided idea about wanting it to be a 1940s style blouse as opposed to a 50s style blouse because I'd read about Dior. I don't know, anyway. So, you know, it's not brilliantly sewn in. You can see here that, you know, I obviously didn't mark on the sewing line or anything, and it's sort of, you know, wants to sit further up than it is, but gathered down pretty neatly. The cuff band, I remember I had to make my own pattern piece. It's not well gathered into the cuff at all. And as you can see, look at that poor pressing, lining around to the wrong side. Ugh. Yeah, again, poor pressing, lets it down. I think that's, you know, biggest takeaway from this is the difference that good pressing makes to a garment. Yeah, I don't think there's any interfacing in there. No. Oh, maybe there is. Nope, I don't think there is. I think it's just seam allowance. So obviously didn't grade it very well. Looks like I didn't grade the seam allowance there. Fair enough. In the theatre, we very rarely grade seam allowances because it makes things more alterable. But now, personally, when I make my clothes, like, I just hate the feel of the bulk when I wear them. So I'm like, grade all that seam allowance out, but it does mean they're more difficult to alter in the future. So let's talk about this hem. First of all, it's really badly pressed. I mean, look at that there. Oh God, Jesus. And I obviously didn't really know anything about easing in. I think that's part of the issue. You know, if I had understood that I needed to ease it, it looks like I started at this end and the feed dog has rubbed it this way. Yeah, because look, that seems matching up nicely and that seems matching up nicely, and then we get over here and it's like, no way. It's also slightly curved, so, you know, that's tricky, I suppose. Well, trickier than a straight hem. Yeah, that's a little embarrassing. I think that really lets it down. But you know what? All in all, I'm quite impressed. I thought it would be worse than this. I imagine, though, I was pretty proud of this to have kept it. If I thought it was really rubbish, I would have thrown it out a long time ago. I think I did all right. Good job. Good job, 16-year-old Claude. However, this is definitely the best of the three things that I made. So let's move on to the skirt. And we haven't even talked about the hideous petticoat I made either. So I'll be back. Hang on. Oh boy, look at that hideous fabric. Oh my God. Like I say, in my defense, my options were probably pretty limited. My budget was probably pretty limited. So I'm kind of going to forgive myself for that, but thank God my choice of fabrics got better, is all I can say. I actually think probably the choice of fabric is the worst thing about this. I mean, the hem's pretty bad now I look at it. I mean, it obviously hasn't been pressed though, so it might improve with a good pressing. Also, this seam looks like it hasn't been pressed either. I don't know if you can tell. Yeah, you can sort of see that is not very crisp at all. It's a circle skirt. It's a bog standard circle skirt. It is made in two sections. I seem to remember that was because it didn't fit on the width of fabric. Interestingly, I've done a different seam finish here. I've overlocked the pieces before I stitched them up. I imagine that's because this fabric frayed like a bitch. This is more what I would do now, particularly for the theatre, because then I can let that out more easily should this need to go on a bigger person. Not that you'd be letting out the hem of a circle skirt. So yes, the hem is ropey, just overlocked and turned up. Fair enough. However, thinking about that, if this is a twirly circle skirt meant for a dancer in an ensemble, you're going to see that overlocking when they spin around. So that's not what I would do now. I'd probably do bias binding because that would look neater. Perfectly valid as a hem, but maybe not the best choice for this style of skirt and its intended purpose. So let's have a look at the waistband. It looks like it's a straight waistband. fine, that works. To be honest though, if I were to make a skirt like this now, I would prefer to have a slightly curved waistband. Looks like I didn't do a stitch in the ditch. Oh, I did a slip stitch. Let's have a look. Yeah, looks like I did a slip stitch with a single thread. Brilliant. So that is going to rip out. If ever I do any hand sewing on anything that's going to get any kind of wear that I need, that it's not vital is invisible, I will use a double thread just because it's stronger and it's going to launder better. You know, if one thread snaps, the whole thing's going to come undone. Whereas if you've got a double thread, if one of them snaps or wears out, at least you've got a little bit more extra support there. Let's have a look at this fastening. I do remember I had terrible difficulty with this zip. It's a lapped zip and I'd never done one like that before. And I do remember absolutely tearing my hair out and the teacher having to help me. And I think actually I came back and she'd redone it for me because I'd made such a mess of it. And you can see, you know, you can see the scarring from where it's been unpicked and where the horrid satin's pulled. But, you know, that's the thing when you're 16 and you're learning. Look at the pulls in the waistband there as well. It's also weirdly too low down. Don't know why I started the zip there. I think I just didn't know any better. But obviously, you know, I put the top of the cut edge of the zip there as opposed to the top of where the teeth start. So I've got this little opening here. Another Velcro fastening, lovely, but you can see my point about Velcro. One of the reasons I wouldn't use Velcro these days is because of this hard side. You can see it's just destroying the waistband where it's catching on the threads, particularly of this satin. It's gone all fuzzy and yeah. But again, should have zigzagged it on. Did think to put it on before I made up the waistband though, so I didn't zigzag through, so I didn't stitch through both layers of the waistband so it was invisible on the inside, so points there. I'm also impressed that I did an underlap instead of an overlap. Can't believe I thought about that. It must have been in the sewing pattern because I do remember I used a sewing pattern to make this skirt. Again, poor pressing, haven't turned that corner out properly. Look at that unpressed seam. Why didn't I press that seam? Oh my god. Anyway, so this I think is definitely of a lower standard than the blouse. I think the blouse is better than this. I don't think I made this first. I think I made the blouse first. So maybe I made this in a hurry. I was meeting a deadline. I can't remember. But yeah, this was more the standard I was expecting. The blouse was better than I was expecting, but this was what I was expecting to be a bit cringe. Speaking of a bit cringe, let's have a look at this net petticoat I made. Okay, now this is hilariously bad. This is really embarrassing to look at now. First of all, what is with this net? Why did I choose the droopiest net in the world to make a net petticoat out of? I don't know, maybe it was all I had. But this is literally just a tube of lining fabric with this, oh, look, a French seam. Oh, bloody hell. Oh, quite well done, French seam. Not brilliantly pressed. Again, the importance of pressing. But yeah, elasticated waist channel. So I imagine I probably did a French seam here because that was another technique. So you got, the more techniques you use, the more marks you got. Although why on earth I snipped it there, I have no idea. Did I do the classic thing of, yeah, look what I've done. It goes this way at the bottom where I've attached it to the net, and it goes that way at the top. So I had to snip it so that it laid flat. Ah, yeah, I mean, the gathers, what I suppose I should talk about here is how bad these gathers are. Look, I obviously did it with a running stitch, which I've left in. Look, and it's huge. That's not how you should gather by hand. I obviously tried to gather by machine and it didn't work, or maybe this was like tacking it on or something and I didn't remove it. I don't know. But it's bad. I mean, the gathers are so uneven. Look at this one. Look at that. It's just like a lump of net there and then nothing either side. And it's not well sewn on at all. I didn't finish this raw edge of the lining fabric. It's just, oh God, look at that. Oh, yeah, this is embarrassing. I seem to remember that this was kind of an afterthought. This was like, I had a week left or something before the deadline and my teacher was like, let's make a net petticoat. So I did this. Interesting. Oh, look, another different seam finish. What have I done here? Oh, I've zigzagged it. Okay, interesting choice. bother French seaming it here. Maybe again it was because the more things you did, the more marks you got, but okay, acceptable. Looks kind of weird though through the net, in my opinion. I wish I'd done something else. I'm getting picky about the seam finish I used on the world's shittest net. Anyway, yeah, so this is definitely the worst of the bunch, I think. And it's a little bit embarrassing, and I'm putting it on the internet for everyone to see. But honestly, the reason I wanted to make this video was because I wanted to demonstrate that everybody starts at the beginning. There is no way to get better at sewing apart from one garment at a time. I did not wake up one day and was magically able to make historical costumes. It doesn't work like that. Yes, I had the benefit of a formal education, and do not underestimate the value of having somebody stood over your shoulder going, no, you're doing it wrong. But essentially, the most valuable thing that my degree gave me was time. It gave me 40 hours a week for 3 years where all I did was just practice sewing. And even at this point in my sewing journey or whatever, I'd been sewing for 3 years. Not a lot, let's say an average of an hour a week. But over 3 years, that's, what, 156 hours? You know, I was quite far into my sewing, even at this point. These weren't the first garments I'd made from a sewing pattern. I think I've still got the very first one. Maybe I'll dig that out for another video. But I think this was the second and third thing I'd ever made from a sewing pattern. But, you know, I had made countless bags and cushions and things before that, none of which I kept because they were all so bad. So if you are a beginner and you're frustrated about the fact that you see all these things on the internet that are amazing and you're not there yet, please know the only way to get there is to keep going. You know, then your next garment will be better than the last one, and then the one after that will be better than the next one, and you will get there. You know, there's no shortcuts. It's just, you just have to keep on sewing. As I was just thinking about this project, it came to me that I might actually still have the sewing pattern that I used to make this blouse, and it turns out I do. It's McCall's 2094. It's originally from 1999, so even in 2009 this was out of date. And it's Mrs. Top's long sleeve, short sleeve, sleeveless, you know, it's one of these 8 great looks in one. So not only do I still have the original pattern, but I've also got the bits that I used to do the slash and spread on the sleeves. So these are, you know, the bits that I cut up and I slashed apart, and this is my new sleeve pattern. So having discovered this, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I remade this project 10 years later with the benefit of a professional costume degree and 5 years professional costume making experience. However, the pattern is cut to the smallest size, which is a size 10, and I'm usually a 14 these days, so I'm not sure it's gonna fit. So I actually just tried the blouse on, and it turns out it does fit, and that's because, thank goodness for the 90s, the finished garment measurements for this size, the given measurement, the size chart measurement, is 83 centimetre bust, that is 32.5 inches, and the final garment measurements is a 94 centimetre bust, which is 37 inches. So there are 11 centimetres of ease in this pattern. So yeah, it still fits miraculously. So I think this calls for a silly little project. I've got some fabric in my stash that I think I'll use for this, but I don't know what I'll do for the skirt because I do not have anything remotely like that horrid orange polyester satin. But yeah, I think this calls for a little project, so that might have to be a separate video because I imagine this one's pretty long. So I hope you enjoyed this silly trip down memory lane for me revisiting my old high school sewing project. I'm glad to say I've come a long way in 10 years, 11 years, crikey. I will say it again because I do really genuinely mean it. It means a lot to me that there are 5,000 people who want to watch my videos. So I want to thank you all for your continued support. I always love reading your comments, so let me know how you're doing, how 2021 is treating you so far. Let me know what sewing project you're working on. Did you enter the Foundations Revealed competition? Let me know what your entry was so I can look out for it if you did. Yeah, let's have a chat in the comments. I've been standing up too long, so my legs are going dead and I'm starting to feel faint, so I better wrap this up. There will be another video at some point about the making of McCall's 2094, so if that's something you're interested in and you're new here, why not subscribe and join this little community of weirdos sewing on the internet. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Is this entire project just a way for me to procrastinate editing my Relaxed Regency videos? Yes, the answer's yes. Hello and welcome back to what is officially the silliest project I have ever made, and this is coming from a woman who made herself an adult-sized version of a 1930s owl costume that was originally designed for a 6-year-old. Now, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you should probably go and watch this video before carrying on here because it will make everything a lot clearer. But if you can't be bothered with that, which is fair enough, essentially to celebrate reaching 5,000 subscribers on this channel, I decided that I should try and remake the hilarious orange monstrosity that was my final textiles project from high school. As usual, this quick and silly project turned into a lot more work than I had first anticipated, so what was supposed to be one dumb video has turned into 3 dumb videos. This is the second in the trilogy, where I'm going to remake this supposedly 1950s style blouse intended to be a costume from the musical West Side Story. Yeah, like I say, watch the other video and things will make a lot more sense. By some miracle, given that I've moved house about 6 times since I left high school, I still have the original sewing pattern that I used all those years ago. And so now I thought it would be interesting to see just how much I've improved as a maker after 11 years, 2 more sewing qualifications, and about 5 years professional experience. I really hope I've improved, otherwise this is going to be really damaging for my professional reputation. Anyway, I left off that previous video contemplating which fabric from my stash I should use for this project, and so here I am talking you through that decision.
So I think I've made a decision about my fabric. I have got this white, I think it's a cotton, it might be a blend, sort of a lawn weight. It's got this woven stripe into it, and I used this to make a Victorian blouse for a job ages ago. I overbought on the fabric just in case, and so I've had this bit left, which I've had plans to kind of turn into a mock Edwardian blouse, but I actually think a sort of retro 50s, 40s style blouse I'll get more wear out of. I've gone through my scrap fabric stash, and I did contemplate using one of these like craft weight cottons that I've got random fat quarters of and things to do the contrasting collar and cuff, but I've actually decided that I don't like that. So what I think I'm going to do instead is I'm going to play with the direction of the stripes. So the stripe's going to be vertical on the body, then horizontal for the bands and the cuff, and that will give enough visual interest. So I think I'm going to put these away and just make it in the white.
But before I started cutting, I needed to do a fitting to double check that this pattern was actually still going to fit me 11 years later.
So it had been my intention to play about with the styling, you know, to change the sleeves and change the collar, but I actually really like the style of this more than I expected. The only things I'm going to change are the fit, because it's too tight at the hips, and strangely it's falling off the shoulder, and the neckline fits relatively well. Yeah, the neckline fits relatively well, so it shouldn't be. So I need to take out some width there. Do you see, and bring that up? And then it'll be a bit more of a sort of statement shoulder, a bit more 40s, but yeah, I like it. I think it's cute. I might make the collar wider, because I think that's the thing with the balance of a garment like this, with these big sleeves. I think this is too narrow. I think it needs to be wider. But I think that's all the alterations I'm going to do. I'm going to make it slightly narrower through the chest because it's still too big, and I'm going to widen it through the hips because it's too small. Look, you can see it's gaping there.
Pattern alterations decided on, I recut my pattern pieces and then began cutting them out. I had a very oddly shaped length of this fabric left, which meant I had to get a bit creative with my cutting layout. But thankfully I had almost exactly enough fabric to make this work.
So yesterday evening I cracked on with the pattern adjustments for this pattern because I needed to let it out of the hip and it drops off the shoulder ever so slightly. It's on the mannequin here, that's what I'm pointing at. And so I took the shoulder in and I let the hip out a little bit. So I traced everything off onto dot and cross pattern paper and I made my adjustments. You can see I've added about 1 centimetre on each part of the hips. That should give me 4 centimetres extra total, which should be enough. And I also then shortened it. I think part of the reason why it was so tight at the hip was that I essentially just cut it. The pattern piece had a flared shape at the hip, but I chopped all that off rather than shorten it properly. So I shortened it properly this time around, so hopefully things will be fine. If it's a bit big on the hip, I'll just take it in. I also have cut my collar pieces. Do you know, I was gonna like re-toile the collar and put it on the stand and see how I felt, and then I just decided to add 1 centimetre around the outside and just make it fractionally bigger. So I think that will just help with the balance a little bit, and also if I'm taking the shoulder in, perhaps that will also help with the balance. So what I've done here, the collar and the cuffs, these are the cuffs. So these have the stripes you can just about see going around, and on the collar as well it will be around the neck. And the shirt itself has the stripes going this way, so it will be vertical this way and then horizontal around the cuffs and horizontal around the neck. And I think that will just provide a little bit of visual interest in the same way that the polka dot does on the cuff here, but I think it will just be a bit more sophisticated. So everything's cut out now. I kind of got cracking with that because cutting's difficult for me and I don't really like to dwell on it and make it into a bigger thing than it needs to be by filming it. So I'm going to move on to the marking up now, and because that's something I definitely didn't mark this project up. I didn't think I even knew about the concept of marking up until I went to university. So I'm definitely going to mark up these darts though, because I reckon that's one of the reasons why these darts ended up not being very good. And then we shall start sewing. Ooh, it's exciting. It's coming together. It's coming together.
I bought myself some of these friction pens which disappear with heat, and I must confess I am absolutely converted from tailor's chalk, particularly for white fabrics. The only downside is I keep forgetting and ironing away lines when I'm not supposed to, but they were ideal for these darts. I hadn't yet cut out my interfacing, so I then quickly did that. Unlike my high school project, I went for sew-in woven interfacing. I just prefer it as I find it's more comfortable to wear against the skin and washes better. It does, however, mean that it has to be tacked to the main fabric. I did this with long diagonal basting stitches. Then I stitched in the darts and completed the basic bodice construction, side seams, shoulder seams, etc. Of course, this time around I was very careful to precisely run off the end of the dart and didn't reverse, tying off the loose threads for a sharper point. I pressed the darts using a tailor's ham, something I definitely didn't do at high school because we just didn't have them. I definitely remember going to university and wondering what that weird checked thing on the ironing board was, but the tailor's ham allows you to press fabric into a curved shape that imitates the way it will eventually lie on the body. I then made up all the other components of the blouse. I like to work like this now, starting by making up all the bits I'll need in advance of when I will actually need them. I feel it's quicker, but it also means I can batch similar tasks together, which, as you will know from my Sewing with a Disability video, helps save energy. I then removed the tacking from the collar and graded the seam allowances for a lovely crisp edge. I also notched the curves to reduce bulk once they are turned through. Once I turned the collar right side out, I rolled the seam allowances between my fingers to get the seam line precisely on the edge of the collar before pressing it.
So yesterday I got to the point of having made everything up, well, almost everything. So I've got my collar made up, got my sleeves made up, and I've got the gathering stitches sewn in, ready to go for those. The body of the blouse is made up. So today I'm going to start by getting out my overlocker and overlocking all the raw edges as I did for the original that I made. And then I think I'm going to do the collar first because I prefer to do the collar before I put the sleeves in and get the facings on. I don't know if I'll get the sleeves in today. I might get the cuffs on the sleeves instead. And then we'll leave setting in the sleeves for tomorrow. After that, It's just buttons and buttonholes. I need to decide what kind of buttons I'm having. It's amazing how quickly it's coming together, considering that this originally took me probably several months of, you know, a few hours every week to be able to work on it solidly. I'm gonna have a blouse in a couple of days, so that's nice. I'm sure part of that is I don't spend most of the time chatting to my friends, and part of it is I'm just better and more practiced than I was when I was 15. Let's crack on and see if we can't make a big dent in the construction of this blouse, because I've also got to make a skirt. I forgot to mention that today is the day that I actually woke up to 5,000 subscribers, and so if you don't believe me, look at that. I'm really excited. I know they say you shouldn't focus on the numbers and all of that, but yeah, I can't help it. It means a lot. It means a lot that maybe this wasn't such a terrible idea.
I chose to overlock the seam allowances together and then press them to one side as I had done on the original blouse. This is an industrial technique that we don't tend to use in the theatre as it makes things more difficult to alter. But as I highly doubt I will ever alter this blouse, I went with it. Something people always ask me about overlocking is what to do with the cut threads to stop them unravelling. I like to simply thread them back on themselves using a darning needle. It's neat, easy to unpick if you do have to undo your overlocking, and much quicker than the alternative, which is zigzagging over them. Before attaching the collar, I stay stitched the neckline to stop the curve stretching out.
So, as I have come to pin my collar on, I have realised something. You may remember that I added a centimetre all the way around the collar to make it bigger, and actually now I look at it, I can see that I thought about this, but I obviously didn't do anything about it, because it now means that the collar is too long to fit into the neckline. So you see, if we match this balance mark here, yeah, that there's supposed to be obviously 1.5 centimetre seam allowance there to attach the facing, and there's also then supposed to be a gap. If we look at the lady who's modelling it, you can see that there's a notch, you know, there's a gap between the edge of the facing and the edge of the collar. So I need to make my collar a bit smaller. Not the end of the world, just means I'll have to flip it back the other way and machine a bit off the edge. So you can see here with my paper pattern, I obviously got halfway through this thought and then abandoned it because this was the old cut line on the paper pattern, and I did shave it off. I did round out this corner here on the pattern, but I obviously didn't cut it, and I didn't cut it out like that. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use that line as my new cutting line and see what happens. Okay, so I've restitched it now. You can see this was my first attempt, but this ended up with a weird point here, which really was not very pleasing. So I rounded it off just a little bit more, and now it looks much better when you turn it through. It's got a sort of really nice, even sort of gentle curve to it. So I'm going to trim this back up, press it again, grade the seam allowance, and then carry on with the collar.
The pattern had this rather unusual technique for attaching the collar, which is something I've only ever seen in this kind of commercial paper pattern. The centre section of the collar that wasn't covered by the facing had the seam allowance snipped into and is pinned out of the way so that the rest of the collar and the facing can be machined on in one go. This is the sort of shortcut I hate, but I decided to do it as the instructions said, although I was very careful to tack everything in place first. I then realised I hadn't finished the edges of the facing, so I did this quickly using the technique I had used originally, just turning the wrong side up 0.5 centimetre and edge stitching it in place. But then my poor, beloved, reliable Benina jammed. I ended up having to disassemble a lot of the machine to get the facing out from under it, and then I gave it a good clean. So after that brief detour to do some machine maintenance, I was able to carry on stitching, but poor old Bunny the Benina was not sounding happy at all. I carried on with the construction of the facing, pressing under the seam allowance at the collar, as this would be hand stitched in place later. Before stitching the collar, I snipped the seam allowance of the body up to my stay stitching line so that I could ease the curved neckline into the straight collar a little easier. I then pinned the facing into position, sandwiching the collar between the blouse and the facing. The facing is stitched in place in one go, starting at the hem of the blouse. I then pivoted at the top, rounded off the point ever so slightly to get a sharper angle once the facing is turned through. Then carried on sewing along the neck, catching the facing and the tacked-on collar at the same time. I made sure to keep the top layer of the collar well out of the way as I stitched, as this layer would be turned under and hand stitched in place later. I stitched all the way around to the other side of the collar, pivoted again, rounded off the point of the facing, and then stitched down the front to the hem. Miraculously, everything had gone as planned, so I could begin removing the tacking. I graded the seam allowances at the neck and the facing to reduce bulk and to help the collar lay nicely. I also chopped off the excess at the corner to get that sharp point. Then, more pressing, again using the tailor's ham. One of the things that had really let the original blouse down was poor pressing, so this time around I was sure to press everything really well. I notched the seam allowance of the collar to help that straight edge curve around the neck, and then turned under the top layer of seam allowance to hide all the raw edges. I pressed and then pinned it in place. I also pinned those top edges of the facing that I had pressed under earlier to the seam allowance of the shoulder seam. These were then hand stitched in place with a herringbone stitch. I chose a herringbone stitch rather than the original slip stitch I had used, as this allows for more movement, which should reduce drag lines once the blouse is on the body. I did, however, slip stitch the collar seam allowance in place, although this time I used a double length of thread for strength. The next step was to make up the cuffs. These were just rectangles joined along one of the long edges. This seam was pressed open, and then the short edges of the cuff were joined to form a loop. I was careful to make sure my seam allowances stayed flat as I stitched over them. This seam was then pressed open. The bottom of the sleeve was gathered down to fit the circumference of the cuff, then stitched in place with right sides together. I realised after sewing all the way around that I had still had my stitch length turned up from sewing the gathering stitches, so I had to sew around the cuff again. I then pressed the cuff in half precisely along the seam before turning the seam allowance under to hide all the raw edges on the wrong side. This was then sewn in place with the slip stitch. I then set the sleeves into the armhole. I matched up my balance marks and then pulled on my gathering threads to gather the sleeve head down to fit. I smooth and stroke the gathers to evenly distribute the volume before pinning and tacking them in place. I always sew my sleeves in two halves. I begin with the underarm section, sewing with the body of the garment facing up. These two curves should match exactly, and you shouldn't be easing anything in. Then I turn the sleeve around and go back to where I started, only this time I sew with the sleeve itself facing up. This way I can better control the volume of the gathers and ease everything in smoothly. If you'd like to see a tutorial of how I do this in more detail, there'll be a card linking you to a video I made about that.
I've gained some fake wisteria since you last saw me. It's been a little while since I checked in, and so I just thought I'd update you with where I am. So, sleeves are on, cuffs are on, They are long. They come past the elbow, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I tried the original one on and that's what they do, so we're going with it. In the future, however, if to get more wear out of this, I think I will chop them ever so slightly because it's not a very flattering place where it hits. Flattering, I shouldn't use the word flattering. It's not a very pleasing place where it hits. The other thing is that typical bloody brain fog moment. I measured the front length of the original blouse and I added seam allowance for the neck edge, but I didn't add a hem allowance when I was cutting out, so the blouse is too short. So I've just overlocked around the edge and I'm literally going to have to just flip it up and top stitch it, which is fine, but yeah, kind of annoying. You know, I should have measured twice and cut once, but I didn't because my brain doesn't work properly and I didn't think about it. So, you know, not the end of the world. So sleeves went in relatively well. I've got to get the overlocker out and overlock them, which is why I'm stopping for today because I don't have the strength for that. The overlocker's heavy. And then buttons and buttonholes and the hem, and it's done. So I've put it on the stand with the original skirt. The other original blouse is under here, so that's why it's looking a bit bulky. The hips flare, I added quite a lot of hip flare and it's quite dramatic, but then it now sort of balances the ease of the rest of the garment. So, you know, it's not very slim fitting through the waist and the bust. It's kind of blousy all the way through and now the hips match that, so I quite like that, so I think I'm going to go with it. Anything else that I want to talk about with this? Fabric for the skirt is in the post, so that should be here soon, hopefully. It's snowing today, so I imagine that slowed things down. But apart from that, yeah, I'm calling it a day because I woke up at 4 AM again this morning, so yes, I'm very tired.
The next day, I did get the overlocker out and overlocked those armhole raw edges. I also gave that seam a press over my tailor's ham so that the seam allowance went down into the sleeve. For the hem, I started by sewing the bottom of the facing to the blouse with right sides together. I then trimmed the corner and turned the facing right side out. This turned up the first section of the hem for me, which I then top stitched in place. I didn't pin or baste or even press it up, I just turned it up and eased it in as I went. The hem was so narrow and curved that it was actually easier to ease and sew it a little at a time as I got to it. I then used my new wool pressing mat to press the hem nice and flat. This thing really worked and made a noticeable difference, so 10 out of 10 would recommend.
Well, okay, so the blouse is 95% finished. The only thing left to do is the button and buttonholes on the centre front. And I must confess I'm a little nervous because my lovely Bernina machine has had a lot of use this year, much more than it usually gets. And it's starting to go a little bit on the blink. And as we all know, buttonholes are pretty hard going on machines, and I'm nervous about it. So I'm torn between. Obviously, I'm going to make a sample. Always make a buttonhole sample, but I am genuinely worried that if I put my machine through this, I won't be able to use it. I can't get it serviced because we're in lockdown. I do have a backup machine somewhere in the loft, but goodness knows what years in the loft have done to that. I've also got my antique wooden machine down here, but obviously that doesn't have a buttonhole feature. Part of me is really tempted to wait to do buttonholes until I can get this machine serviced, but because we're in a global pandemic, who the hell knows when that's going to be? So I don't really want to put Velcro on it like I did with this one, because Velcro is just a really horrible material. It's really hard on clothes. It snags them and pulls them and doesn't wash well. Could I suppose do snaps instead? We could do a lot of, poppers in theatre for quick changes as well. But I would really like this to be a functioning wearable blouse. I think I'm just going to have to bite the bullet and try the buttonholes on this Bernina. Okay, wish me luck. Oh, the other thing though about this blouse is that the pattern, the buttonholes go horizontally, which is weird because I was always taught that buttonholes on shirts should be vertical as opposed to horizontal. Should I do what the pattern says or should I use my judgment? I think because it's such a wide facing, and it also looks like they recommend quite small buttons. 16mm buttons. That's pretty small. Don't know about what sort of buttons I've got. I need to figure this out. I'm leaving you. I've got things to do.
In the end, I decided to go in the loft and find my old touring sewing machine from when I was well enough to actually go away on tour. The benefit of this machine is that it has an automatic buttonhole foot, which my Bernina doesn't, so I had to practice with that before measuring and marking up my centre fronts. I measured the original blouse to determine the position of the buttons, only to discover that they were, in fact, majorly wonky. I did decide to evenly space the buttons on my new version and marked out the position for the buttonholes. I decided to go for vertical buttonholes as they fit quite nicely between the woven stripes on the fabric. The automatic buttonhole foot uses this little lever to know when the buttonhole is big enough. If you've never used one before, here's a little clip of how it works. You have this weird plastic attachment where you put the actual button you are going to use, and then the machine somehow knows how big to make the buttonhole and changes direction once the button touches the lever. That's a really bad explanation of how it works, so I've left in the full clip so you can just see for yourself. As I used the friction pens to mark up the buttonholes, I gave them a press to remove the ink, and then I added a little fray check before I cut them open. You might remember that I lost my buttonhole chisel when I made my 1950s dress. Well, I finally found it, so I could cut the buttonhole open with my chisel. I put some cardboard under the buttonhole as extra protection and then tried unsuccessfully to push the chisel through. In the end, I had to bash the end of the chisel with the only vaguely sturdy object I had to hand, my tailor's ham. Not its intended purpose, but it did the job. All that was left to do was to sew on the buttons. I matched the centre fronts up and pushed a pin through each buttonhole to determine where the corresponding button had to be sewn on. I stitched my buttons on over a pin so that they don't end up so tight to the fabric that the other side of the blouse can't sit flat underneath them. I then remove the pin and create a little thread shank by wrapping the thread around the button several times and pulling it tight. I then fasten off the thread on the wrong side, and with that, the blouse was finished. So, all in all, I think I'm going to call this project a success. It definitely turned out better than the original, so thank goodness for that. I don't have to tear up my degree certificate. It's turned out weirdly trendy, which is not something I usually go for. I haven't really indulged in fast fashion trends for about 10 years because, you know, I've been trying to be a more ethical consumer and buy secondhand clothes and make my own clothes and all of that sort of thing. But it is I'm not gonna lie, it is kind of nice to have something cool for once. And, you know, that's the wonderful thing about making your own clothes. I can still, you know, indulge in fashion, experiment with style, and not contribute to environmental degradation or the exploitation of a largely female workforce. And in terms of environmental impact, I used stash fabric for this. I used a pattern that's originally from 1999 and I've had for 10 years. So, you know, it's nice to look cool and not feel guilty for a change. I am really curious how the sort of chapter 3 of this series is going to go, because circle skirts are pretty classic in shape, they're pretty timeless. So is the trendy nature of the blouse going to make the circle skirt also look really modern, or is the sort of more timeless look of the circle skirt going to make the blouse look more vintage? I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. So if you'd like to watch a video where I make a circle skirt to replace this abomination, you should subscribe, because there will be a video about that at some point in the future. But apart from that, all that's left to say really is thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Alright, here we are again for the final part in this little series where I remake my high school sewing project. In the previous two parts, I looked at just how bad the sewing was on the original version of this ensemble, which to my surprise wasn't that bad. And in the second part, I remade the blouse. So if you'd like to watch those videos before you carry on with this one, I will put links to them below and above in the cards. Whereas for the blouse, I used stash fabric, for the skirt, I did have to buy some fabric that was suitable. I chose this ex-designer silk viscose blend from Rainbow Fabrics Kilburn. They have lots of dead stock fabrics, particularly this year with so many cancelled fast fashion orders. They've got lots of lovely printed dress viscoses, so if that's something you're interested in, I do recommend them. I'm not sponsored by them, I just like to try and support businesses that are making an effort to be more sustainable. Now, this fabric is lovely and silky, which means it's going to be a nightmare to cut. I also have the dilemma of trying to match the stripes on a circle, so it's going to take some figuring out. But sometimes it's best to just not overthink things, so let's get cracking. Now, I realised as I was editing this video that I never actually showed you how to draft a circle skirt pattern. There are seemingly endless tutorials for how to do this online, and I can highly recommend those on YouTube made by Annika Victoria and The Closet Historian. But here's how I did it for this skirt. So firstly, we're going to have to do some maths. Start by taking your waist measurement and add however much seam allowance you want to use. For my skirt, I was going for 2.5 centimetres of seam allowance on each side of my seam, so 5 centimetres total. We are then going to divide that number by 6.28, or 2 pi if you're into geometry, and that is going to give us the radius of our circle. Don't be put off by the word radius, it's just the name for the distance from the very centre of the circle to the outer edge. So in my case, my waist measurement was 70 centimetres plus 2 lots of 2.5 centimetres for the seam allowance equals 75 centimetres. I then divide that by 6.28. No matter what your waist measurement or seam allowance is, you always divide by 6.28. That part always stays the same. So 75 centimetres divided by 6.28 equals 11.942675. Yeah, you know what, let's just call it 12. 12 centimetres. When in doubt, round up. Then to make the pattern piece, we are going to start with a square of paper. Make it pretty big, at least as long and wide as you want your skirt to be, plus the radius measurement we just worked out. Then measure down from the top right hand corner that radius measurement we calculated earlier. For me, this was 12 centimetres. Then we are going to draw a curve by measuring 12 centimetres away from that top corner around in a circular motion like this. This is the waist of the skirt. Then we need to draw a second curve for the hem. To draw this line, we need to measure down from the top right hand corner again, our original radius, so 12 centimetres for me, and then add however long you want your skirt to be. For me that's 60 centimetres, so a total of 72 centimetres. Then we are going to draw our curve again by measuring 72 centimetres down from the top right hand corner in a circular motion like this. When we're done, you should have a pattern piece that looks something like this. Cut it out and we can begin cutting the fabric. Well, first of all, I actually made my skirt too long and had to cut 5 centimetres off the hem. I did this by just measuring up 5 centimetres along the curve of the hem and then chopping it off along that line. With this striped fabric, I spent a long time carefully matching up all the stripes. This was made doubly tricky as to cut a circle skirt like this, you have to fold the fabric in half once lengthways and once widthways, so that you have 4 layers of fabric. I played around with the placement of the selvages and the direction of the stripes a lot until I was happy. As I only added seam allowance to the side seams of the skirt, I had to mark on the seam allowance at the waist and the hem.
one of the most difficult things I've cut in a very, very long time. Oh boy, it is nowhere near perfect, but it's okay. It's pinned together, right sides together at the moment, but what I was able to do with the cutting was, oh, that's great. Just knocked over my pins. What I was able to do, which I'm quite pleased with, is get this wide orange stripe down the centre, so that's going to be running vertically to the ground. And then the peachier stripes should match up on the diagonal. You can see I ended up chalking it on my cutting lines and then cutting it differently. So I'm going to have to go in and sponge off those chalk marks. But yeah, that was kind of stressful. So I'm glad it's done. Sometimes there's nothing for it but to just jump in the deep end and give it a go. And that's what I did. And I think it's going to be all right. Still got to cut the waistband. And I was hoping to do bias binding for the hem, but I'm not sure I'll have enough of this fabric left to actually make enough bias. We'll see. Maybe it'll have to be a very skinny bias binding. It's done. So I've got some thread, got some stash thread, which should be quite good for this. I think it's polyester. Yeah, it's very old though, so hopefully it's still nice and strong. But yeah, I think this is probably the trickiest bit of this done. Oh, the zip though. Got to put in a zip. But I have got one in the right colour this time at least, and the right size, which makes a change for me.
Once cut and pinned together, I carefully tacked the side seams in place, making sure the stripes matched up exactly on each side. I measured and marked the placement for the zip so that I would know not to sew that bit shut. I then very slowly and carefully machined precisely along my tacking line. When I got to the opening for the zip, I changed to a basting stitch. Or at least, I thought I did, but I ended up just moving the machine needle. I still haven't been able to get my Bernina serviced and haven't quite gotten used to this brother machine yet. I basted the zip opening closed, ready to install the zipper later. Then I began carefully removing the tacking I had just machined over. This was tricky, but it was worth it to make sure the stripes matched exactly. I then pressed those seams open.
Okay, so I have stitched up and pressed my seams in my skirt. As you can see, I spent a very long time making sure to match the stripes correctly. In terms of seam finish, on the original skirt, I overlocked the raw edges, and I did contemplate doing that on this. However, I don't have enough of the right colour thread, so I would have to either do it in white or black or green. And I did it in white on the original, but I don't like the way that looks. So I've actually just left the selvages. So I've used the selvages as the seams, that I can just leave the edges. I mean, it's not a very nice selvage because it's so fluffy. I might go in and trim it, but to be honest, I don't think I have the patience for that. So I think I'm just going to leave it. You know, there are probably better ways to do it. I suppose I could have done a French seam, but I want to try and make it as much like the original as possible. And in the original, I really struggled with doing that lapped zip, and I don't think I've actually done one since I made that orange skirt behind me. So I think it's time to tackle that. I've prepped the opening, it's tacked shut, and I've marked where the zip has got to go. Amazingly, I had a zip in the right shade and length. It is unfortunately one of these polyester coil zips, which I generally don't like to use, but you've got to work with what you got sometimes. So because I haven't done a lap zip ever successfully, it's time to get out my favourite go-to sewing book. This is it's one of the only sewing books I really recommend. This is the only book you'll ever need. It teaches you everything, including how to scale up gridded patterns, which is very useful for costume making. My edition is from the 70s. Let's have a look when it was first published. I think it's, 1978. Oh, it's a first edition. That's exciting. But I do believe that this book is still in print. It was one of the very few set texts I had at university. The other one was Nora Waugh's Corset and Crinolines. So I do really recommend this book. It's got instructions for how to do a lapped zip, so I think I'm going to use these instructions. I did look at a few tutorials online, but there was never like a consistent way of doing it that I found across tutorials. So I'm going to trust the Reader's Digest because they usually work for me. The other brilliant thing about this book is it's got some really hilarious sort of 70s sewing patterns in the back. I mean, frankly, look at that. Oh, lovely. But my absolute favourite has got to be Derek the dinosaur. Look at that. I mean, who doesn't need a giant cuddly dinosaur in their life? Anyway, I'm procrastinating. Time to crack on with this zip.
The Reader's Digest instructions said to pin and baste one half of the zip in place, centering the zip teeth over the tacked shut seam. Then it said to flip the zip over so that the right side was facing up to reveal the seam allowance, and to machine through all thicknesses as close to the zip teeth as possible. It optimistically said pin if required. There was no way I was accurately going to be able to machine down this tiny width of visible seam allowance without pins. And in fact, I went a step further and tacked it because I was not feeling confident about this turning out right. I switched to a zipper foot and began carefully sewing along that line I had just tacked. This was really counterintuitive. You are essentially top stitching the zip in place, but from the wrong side. It was very confusing, and I didn't realise it would be visible at the time, and my stitches ended up a bit wonky, so I just went over them instead of unpicking them, which meant I then had two visible lines of stitching. Oh well, this can't be seen when the zip is closed. Then working from the right side, Reader's Digest said to smooth the right side of the fabric to be as flat as possible and pin it in place. Then to tack a guideline for the top stitching 12 to 15 millimeters from that seam. I measured this out with a friction pen for precision before tacking the zip in place. In the end, I didn't top stitch it in place, but did a prick stitch instead, because I thought that the stitching line would disrupt the lines of the stripes. I also then was able to change colour thread as the stripes changed to make them even more invisible. However, I was worried about the prick stitching not being very strong, so I ended up going in and machine stitching the zip to the seam allowance for extra reinforcement. I then gave the zip a good press before removing the tacking that held the zip closed. I undid the zip to check everything worked and did my best to press out some of the scarring that had occurred from the machine tacking. A spritz with water helped. I then began construction on the waistband. This I cut from an orange strip of the fabric, mostly because it was the only one wide enough to have just one colour on the waistband, but also because I liked the idea of having a horizontal orange stripe running perpendicular to the vertical orange stripe I had managed to get at the centre front and back of the skirt. I pressed the waistband in half and then pinned a length of waistband Petersham up against the fold. I decided to use waistband Petersham for strength, seeing as this satin was so slippery. I tacked the Petersham in place with long diagonal basting stitches, as I knew trying to sew the slippery satin to the rigid Petersham was going to be fiddly. Then I machined the Petersham in place down each side, following the stripes as a guide to keep my stitching straight. With right sides together, I stitched the short ends of the waistband shut. It was at this point I realised I was going to be playing thread chicken. Again! Then I trimmed the corners of the seam allowance so that I could turn the corners of the waistband through neatly. Now that I had machined that Petersham in place, I could remove the tacking. Then everything got a good press. The satin was pretty bouncy, so it didn't give as crisp an edge as I would like, but I did manage to get the seam line to roll around to the wrong side quite nicely. I carefully pinned and tacked the waistband to the skirt. Easing in the circular waistline of the skirt to the straight waistband was challenging, and I needed to have the petersham on the inside of the body, so I ended up having to do the hand finishing on the right side. But I was okay with that, as I knew my hand stitching is pretty neat. Once tacked on, I ran the seam through the machine, carefully smoothing and adjust the fabric to avoid puckers. Then I removed the tacking and I double-checked to make sure my waistband matched up over the zip. I've been caught out like this one too many times before, so I always double-check before I begin with hand sewing the waistband in place. I clipped into the seam allowance of the skirt so that the curve would open up and lay flat, and then slip-stitched the turned under edge of the waistband in place, starting with the underlap. Doing this from the right side meant I really took my time to keep my stitches as even and invisible as possible. In the end, it was hardly noticeable, so I'm glad I took my time with it. Next came the fastenings. I used a standard skirt or trouser, hook and bar for the place where the waistband met the edge of the zip, but for the underlap section, I just used a popper. The hook and bar will take all the tension of the closure, whereas the popper is just there to stop the underlap flapping about.
I've actually put my garland up, which is nice, so now I don't have this ugly drain pipe in every shot. Well, I mean, it is in every shot, I've just covered it up so it looks a bit neater now. The circle skirt hem I left overnight and it grew a lot, so I feel it's got some more growing to do probably. I should explain what I'm talking about. So when you cut fabrics on the bias, which is the 45-degree diagonal angle, due to the way that the fabric is woven, that is much stretchier than it is when it's straight. So if you cut something in a circle, or if you cut a skirt, for example, that's got some diagonal seams and some straight seams, over time, the weight of the fabric stretches out the diagonal seam and not the straight seam, and so you get an uneven hem. So if you're making something which is either cut in a circle, like a circle skirt, or has got these bias diagonal seams in, it's really important to let sort of the weight of the fabric settle so that you, and then even up the hem, and then it shouldn't grow as you wear it, because there's nothing worse than beautifully hand finishing a hem and then by the end of the day or the first day of wearing it, your skirt hem looks like this because the diagonal seams have stretched more than the centre front and centre back. So with the nature of that very slippery silk satin, well, viscose silk satin, it's surprisingly heavy, and so on the bias it's growing a lot, it's stretching out a lot. So I left it to stretch out under the weight of itself overnight, but I think I'm going to leave it for another maybe day or so, and I've put little plastic clips around the bottom of the hem, and that should hopefully speed up any drop that's going to happen, and it will hopefully mean that things stretch out evenly. So I haven't decided how I'm actually going to hem this yet. My hope is to do bias binding because that is, in my opinion, the best way to finish a circle skirt. However, with the nature of these stripes, I have got a very little bit of this fabric left. I might see, I think by my calculations, I need like 5.5 meters of bias binding to hem this circle skirt. I don't know if I'm going to have enough, but I'm going to play around and see. If not, I'll have to do probably a hand rolled hem, I think will be best, because I want this skirt to be as long as possible. So I think I'm going to try and get as much bias binding as possible out of this scrap of fabric. It's not usable for anything else really, so if I cut it up and it turns out I don't have enough, it won't be the end of the world. I'll have some nice satiny stripy bias binding to use for something at some point. But yeah, it's nearly done. Because I was using stash thread for this project, I am of course playing thread chicken again. It should be just about all right, but I'm a little bit nervous about it. I have got some other orange or red threads I could use. Just gotta see how it goes, I guess.
And then this is the point in the video where all the quilters in the audience laugh at my ineptitude with a rotary cutter. I measured and cut bias strips of the satin, awkwardly like this, before I realised it was easier to turn the fabric over and roll the rotary cutter away from me. Then I joined all those bias strips together to make one continuous length of bias. I stitched the joins together in a chain to save on thread, as I was drastically running out of thread at this point.
All those seams were pressed open and trimmed to reduce the bulk, and then I began what is easily my least favourite sewing task, levelling the hem. I usually put the stand on the table for this, but due to the low garage ceiling, the stand was too tall to do this, which meant I had to do it on the floor. As you can see in this clip, I am modelling my very fetching beige compression socks and had to psych myself up with a cup of tea. But then I got on with it. I took off all the little clips that I had used to weight the hem. Bulldog clips or closed pegs work just as well if you don't have these little quilter's clips. Once I was in position like this, I realised I had forgotten to go and borrow my dad's meter stick, so I used what I had on hand instead, which was my walking stick. I just put a bit of tape on the stick where the skirt was the shortest and then leaned it up against the skirt and marked with a pin where the bit of tape came to on the hem of the skirt. I really need to buy a skirt hemmer. Please someone remind me in the comments to just buy a skirt hemmer. It would make this process so much easier. I worked my way around the hem, pinning at the tape mark, and then I got my shears and cut the excess off just below the pin. For this, I had to abandon my little stool and sit on the floor because I couldn't get the right angle for cutting. You can see here just how much the skirt grew on the bias, probably a good 10 centimetres or 4 inches. I then spent some time looking at the hem to double check everything was even and level, and if there were any wobbly bits, I just trimmed them up so things were nice and smooth. Then I took the skirt off the stand and began clipping the bias strip in place, ready to sew it to the hem of the skirt with the right sides together. I then machined this in place, trying my hardest not to stretch out the wibbly-wobbly bias curves of both the skirt and the bias tape, while of course desperately hoping that I wouldn't run out of thread. I of course ran out of thread. I had to switch to this much brighter orange, which was a shame, but as you don't see it on the finished hem, it wasn't a huge deal. I carried on sewing the hem before filming some excellent footage of my elbow trimming the curved hem allowance with pinking shears to help the curve turn around to the other side. I pressed the bias first down away from the skirt and then around to the inside and turned the top edge under so that the finished bias strip was 3 centimetres wide. I then carefully slip stitched the hem in place. Like before, when I had been prick stitching the zip, I changed thread colours to coordinate with the stripes, and wherever possible I tried to avoid having red thread on a beige stripe or vice versa. This meant lots of changing of thread and needle, but I think it was worth it. With the hem stitched in place, all it needed was a final press, and the skirt was complete. Here's a little reminder of the outfit before. You can see the clingy, static nature of the skirt satin and the way the blouse is just too wide across the shoulders. Then, with a little bit of TikTok style magic, this is the finished remake. I am so pleased with how the skirt came out. It has such beautiful body and drape and just looks so much more sophisticated than that tacky polka dot Halloween costume. This is possibly the best pattern matching I have ever done, and that lapped zip, which defeated me as a 16-year-old, turned out pretty well. It does gape a touch at the top when the zip is closed because of the bulk of the zipper pull, but I'm okay with that. The waistband is a bit tight, but it certainly gives that 50s cinched waist. I'm so glad I chose to go with a bias binding for the hem. I love the glimpse you get of the stripes on the inside, but even though I spent a long time carefully levelling and hand stitching it, the hem still isn't perfect. But this skirt has an amazing swoosh to it. I tried to do some dramatic turns to show it off, but I had mixed results.
Alright, so that is it for this project. It's all finished. I've put everything on, I've got the blouse on, I've got the skirt on to do a little photo shoot, but I thought I'd also do a little sort of postscript to this project because this has actually been a really great exercise for my self-esteem because I don't really consider myself to be quite a self-confident and self-assured person. However, particularly with my sewing, I definitely have days where I'm like, I'm the biggest fraud in the world, I'm terrible at this, I should never sew
ever again, I'm the worst, you know, all those sorts of things. And actually going back to exactly the same sewing pattern, exactly the same sort of design concept that I had at the very beginning of my sewing journey, and remaking it now has really made me realize that I'm actually pretty good at sewing and I really enjoy it, more importantly. And I might not be the best designer in the world still. I don't think that will ever be a part of my skill set that I ever feel particularly confident in, but I'm at least better than I was. So that's nice. One of the interesting things about sort of perfectionism and sewing for me is that as a disabled person, I've had to let go of so much of my perfectionism because I physically cannot do it. And that's been a really tough learning journey for me, and it feels nice to kind of have arrived at a point now with this project where I really don't care. I guess I've kind of just made my peace with it, and I've come to accept that the standard that I know and believe to be acceptable isn't the standard I can realistically achieve all of the time. That doesn't mean I still can't achieve it if I wanted to. It's just not worth it for me. So it turns out this project's been full of personal growth, I suppose. I'm taking away so many wonderful sort of positive things from making this project, as well as 2 really cute garments that I'm probably going to get quite a lot of wear out of. What more can you ask for in a sewing project, really? So I think that's enough waffling on for now, so all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. See you next time. I don't know if anybody actually noticed this, but I actually swapped out one of my Singing in the Rain posters for a West Side Story one, so it's me and the Jets.